great joy to have you all as participants of this webinar. Greetings to you all. Thank you for joining with us. Thanks to all those who have participating in the webinar. As you know, this is the 20th webinar that HPI is hosting, and it's a great joy and a celebration that we have in HPI whenever we have these webinars. And we feel very happy and proud to have these webinars as God has been leading us, these 20 webinars that we have been having. And that is actually our vision. We reach multitudes in wider context, and we really wanted to do that. And that is why we started this webinar, and praise God that we have reached more than 2,000 people who have been enriched by this webinar. Thanks to the webinar team of HPI, the online college team, who have been initiating this webinar, and they have been really working hard to get this webinar on live. So thank you so much, the webinar team. We acknowledge the presence of God in this webinar, thanking God for His wonderful mercies. And we would like to welcome the presence of our Principal and President, Dr. Paul V. Gupta, and the Senior Vice President, Mrs. Malini Asi, to be present in this webinar. We would like to acknowledge and specially thank and welcome our speaker for the day, Dr. Ian Payne. Thank you so much for coming. And I'd like to also acknowledge the presence of theological students, pastors, and friends of HBI who have joined with us, and a special word of welcome to all the international participants who have come and joined us for this webinar. I'd like to also welcome the staff members of HBI who have joined in this webinar, our faculty members who have joined in this webinar, and not the least, our own students who have been the backbone and the enriching bar for conducting such webinars and such seminars. Thank you so much, and welcome to you all, those who have joined in this webinar. Before we proceed further, I'd like to ask our Vice Principal, Mr. Johnson, to introduce our speaker for the day.
And it's my privilege to introduce today's webinar speaker. And Dr. Ian and I have been connected for more than a year now. And Dr. Ian Payne is an Executive Director for Theologians Without Borders, an interim pastor of Eden Community Church, Auckland, New Zealand. And he was formerly principal and head of theology in SAIACS, South Asia Institute of Advanced Christian Studies, Bangalore, and in the year 2008 to 2018, where he also taught systematic theology for over 20 years. And he is the author of Wouldn't You Love Me? Wouldn't You Love to Know? And Trinitarian Epistemology and Pedagogy. And he is married to Judith, and they have 3 daughters and 5 grandchildren. And it's such a joy to have Dr. Ian, and he has been so busy with so many works. When I requested, and he graciously consented to be our webinar speaker, and he also sent the paper ahead of time, and most of our faculty members should be having the paper, and especially the respondent. I'm sure as he unfolds the paper today, and God is going to use him in a very significant way, and all of us will be really blessed as he presents to us this morning. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and here is Dr. Ian Payne, and over to Sir Theophilus.
Thank you, Sir Johnson, for introducing. Yes, we have been talking about this webinar, especially this webinar, and about Dr. Ian Payne for the past few months. And whenever we have this meeting and we start to talk to Dr. Ian Payne, we were so excited to listen from Dr. Ian Payne. And I'm sure as we introduce to Dr. Ian Payne, he has a lot of experience, and it's going to be a great joy and learning from Dr. Ian Payne. So I'd like to welcome Speaker Dr. Ian Payne to take his time to present his paper. Over to Dr. Ian Payne.
It's great to be with you this evening. For me, it's 4:30 in the afternoon, but I'm glad to know you're having a good Saturday morning there in India. May God bless you all, and hopefully we will explore a few words of Jesus. Actually, it's 6 lines in the Sermon on the Mount, and they are life-changing if we get a hold of them. And so I'm very excited to share that with you. Okay, so I've got a few PowerPoints there that may help us. First of all, Yeah, that's my wife, Judith, and we, as has been mentioned, we have 3 lovely daughters. They've got married now, and there's 3 of the grandchildren. We've got 5 now, so this is a bit of an old photo. Maybe you didn't know, but my history with India goes back to Kerala. My parents, you can see them on the screen. They were missionaries there with CMML in Kerala during the 50s and 60s. So I grew up in Kerala and school in Uti. So India is a special part of my life, and it's a real joy to share with you. Then, as mentioned, I ended up at SAIACS, actually, first of all, as a student, and then later as faculty, and finally, for some crazy reason, they asked me to be principal. And actually, I was pretty diffident about doing that, and a pretty scary job. So anyway, the Lord was good, and we had a thoroughly enjoyable 10 years, and for several times dropped in on HBI in Chennai. So that was great. I am going to be speaking about this passage, Matthew 7:7-10, and perhaps you can see that in your Bible. But just by way of introduction, I think it's good to have an evangelical vision and realize that, of course, that Anthony Paul, do you have a question or no? Okay. Yeah, global vision involves global mission, and the way Christians know or think they know and persuade people is actually something important. In other words, do we know the truth? How can we know the truth as it is in Jesus? And with what confidence can we tell others about the truth that we know? This is a multi-religious world, isn't it? And so everyone thinks they know the truth. And of course, we do as well. So what constrains the character and ethics of our missionary persuasion? Do we put on suicide vests to make our point and blow ourselves up? Well, no, we don't. And there's something far better than doing that. So the answer to all those questions that I've been asking is very simple. How do we know? The one word answer is this: love. Love is the answer to how we know and the answer to the ethics of knowing as well. Love, of course, as it is revealed in Jesus and through the Trinity. So I want to, in this article on ways of knowing, celebrate with you something Jesus has taught us, and I want to help us unpack it in a way that will help us illuminate all sorts of things. So it's really exciting. I'm going to be talking first of all about Jesus and what he says, and then later I will be looking at one instance of the Trinity and insights that the Trinity brings us. In other words, we're looking at what God says through Jesus, and secondly, what God does in Jesus. And then we will talk about how this might apply in your context and mine. Okay, shall we dive into it? First of all, here it is. Keep on asking, Jesus says, and you will receive what you ask for. Keep on asking, you'll receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking, and you will find. Keep on knocking, and the door will be opened to you. So these verses are an absolute treasure for our topic, ways of knowing. So let me unpack this. First of all, let's think about the context of chapter 5 to 7 of Matthew. This is the Sermon on the Mount, isn't it? And Jesus is describing the way faithful followers of the King will live. And he's saying this is going to be decisive for God's blessing. What does he begin with? He begins with the words, blessed are those who, right? So it's all about how his followers will experience a life of blessing. He implies that God's blessing involves following him. In other words, he is the decisive person in relationship to experiencing God's blessing. If you want to know God's blessing, then it's important you follow Jesus, for he is the fulfiller of the law, he is the righteous judge, and in fact, he is the King himself. If the message of Jesus is seek the kingdom of God is among you, well, it raises the question, who is the King? Jesus is the King. And so my point is that the King expects kingdom-shaped living, and the Beatitudes help us understand that distinctive radical shape. Happiness comes to those who least deserve it, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Happiness comes to those who know they least deserve it. So this idea of deserving something is very, very important. The opposite principle we're very familiar with is the principle of desert, the principle of earning something, the principle of karma, the principle of quid pro quo. You get something because you've done something else. A bribe gets a benefit. These are the ideas of I've done something, so I deserve something else. Happiness, Jesus is telling us, does not come to those who think they deserve it. So the principle of grace is needed for the followers of Jesus to see God or possess the kingdom. In other words, Jesus is saying his followers are not those who grab after things, but trust God to give them happiness. And so he is contrasting the very self-righteous attitude of sinners, of Pharisees, with these sort of trusting people. So the Pharisees are those who think they deserve righteousness. They believe they are better than other people because they compare themselves very confidently with others. So they deserve the blessing. And these two ideas are very important. Trusting God gives us something we don't deserve versus expecting God to give us things because we deserve it. And it's the first attitude that is the attitude that Jesus is pressing on us throughout the Sermon on the Mount. So if you look at the beginning verses of chapter 7 in our passage, it's the verses about don't judge others. And of course, Jesus is teaching us not to judge others because that mistakes who we are. We aren't the final judge, and our knowledge doesn't entitle us to judge other people. So Jesus knows how knowledge puffs up, as Paul tells us later. So our knowledge doesn't entitle us to judge other people. And Jesus is wanting us to be aware of the danger of self-commendation and other condemnation. So that's the introduction, the background to the verses that we come to. So we have in ancient philosophy the notion that knowledge is defined as justified true belief. Justified true belief. And of course, that word justified triggers all sorts of things in us, doesn't it? If I'm justified, then I'm pretty good. And I feel like I need a pat on the back. I am justified. Or I am better than other people who can't see, who can't know and don't know the truth. It's interesting when Jesus is about to talk about prayer and about asking things from your parents and about knowledge, he begins with this focus on justification and the very grave danger we have in feeling self-justified. So we think that we know something, and that tempts us to feel self-justified and tempts us to be critical of other people. So once we feel we've seen something, we think we deserve the credit, and we feel entitled to condemn other people. So in verses 1 to 6, we have this warning about the ethics of knowing. If we are to know, then these are some of the dangers. The danger of commending ourselves and the danger of condemning others. So those two things we need to put on each side of the passage we're looking at today. We've got to be careful. Knowledge has ethical implications, and we've got to be very careful about the way we know. So in verses 7 and 8 of Matthew 7, we have Jesus commending a very different way of knowing. Keep on asking, and you will receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking, and you will find. Keep on knocking, and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, everyone who seeks finds, and everyone who knocks, the door will be open to you. Now notice there are 3 verbs. There they are on the screen: asking, seeking, and knocking. And there are 3 outcomes. We will find, we will we'll receive, we will find, and the door will be open. And Jesus is saying these have these 3 actions provide a model for various things. The first model is clearly in verse 9, talking about children asking parents for something. And then in verse 11, clearly Jesus says, now these verses apply to prayer, the way we can come to God. We can know God in prayer as a son knows a father, as a daughter knows a mother. This is the context of knowing in which we can ask and seek and knock. We can receive what we ask for, because asking and seeking and knocking are things you do when you know someone well. When you know God in prayer, asking and seeking and knocking are the important things to do. So my focus is to be on the broadest application of this model. Asking and seeking and knocking aren't just good for parental relations, children with parents, not only good for praying, but also good for knowing generally. So let's have a look. These three verbs are very interesting, and while they no doubt overlap in the sense that you can do each of those three things at the same time, and that's okay. They are distinct enough to be useful to analyze and just look at them briefly, because they are slightly different from each other. Now, the usual word associated with knowledge in the West is seeking. You only think of a scientist, don't you? A scientist is someone who seeks for knowledge and hopefully discovers it. Hence, you seek and you may find. If you seek, you may find. And of course, more associated with traditional knowledge, medieval times, and classical situations, you ask the authorities that know, the church, the guru. You ask someone who knows. And of course, if they are trustworthy and know, then they will receive, you will receive the gift of knowledge from them. So asking involves trusting some authorities and asking for the gift of knowledge from them. And this we call faith. Seeking, on the other hand, is where we go asking questions, and we set out to explore ourselves, and we discover, or we don't. We may lose our way, but we seek and we may find. So questioning is sort of the opposite of trusting. In one sense, trusting is giving yourself to the other person or the thing you want to know, and questioning is withholding yourself from that thing so that there's an objective distance between you and it. So in other words, asking is about faith, questioning and seeking is to do with reason. So faith and reason are two broad categories which Jesus is implying are involved in knowing. So it's important that we see these correlations. That's why I've listed these on screen in the columns. And the third one, which we haven't mentioned, is the business of knocking on the door. And here Jesus is highlighting the relational nature of knowledge. We don't know in a vacuum. We don't know abstract things so much as from within a particular context. What am I saying? When you knock on a door, clearly you are at a particular door, and the vista that opens up, or the person who answers the door and opens the door, these are particular people, particular vistas. And in other words, the asking and the seeking and the knocking happens in a particular setting or a particular context. All right, so already we can see that Jesus' words here in verse 7 to 8 are immensely profound. And what we are being led to is what we could call relational, humble confidence in knowing. Not the sort of thing that will make us swagger into the room and tell someone, hey, you've got a plank, a speck in your eye, let me fix it, and hit them with the plank that's in our own eye. So we have to bring knowledge in a humble sense and in a relational sense, and yet something that is definitely confident that we do know something. All right. So I want to illustrate these three verbs in my life story. I wonder if you recognize this This is the gate to what used to be Hebron School in Kunur. And I want to tell you about seeking, a story that happened in my life when I was 9 years old. And we were cycling home from an inter-school art exhibition in the Ketty Valley. And we were trying to get back to Lushington School. Actually, so this is not where I was trying to get to, but Hebron is now in Uti. So we went down the road towards Kunur from Lushington, and of course the famous railroad passes from Medavakkam all the way up through to Kunur and then on to Uti. And we would have seen this train go by. So the instructions that we were given was that we would go home by the railway track rather than the road. So we were going home a different way, and I got separated from the group. I'd fallen off and my bike wheel was twisted, and suddenly here I was all alone in rural India. I was pretty terrified, and so you did what the best thing is to do there is you burst into tears, and yeah, what happened finally was another student came along, and he had got behind somehow, and so all I had to do was to seek the way home by following him. And so together we followed the railway tracks, and when we had to go off, he knew the way to go, so I just kept following him, and sure enough, made it home also. So much later, I returned to the scene. Here's the picture of someone ahead of you on the path, and that's what it was like. By the time we got home, it was pretty dark, and I was the very last student to make it back to Lushington School. When I was an adult later, seeking took a different form and a bit more confident. Here I am on the top of a bus in Nepal, and we were seeking the truth about life on the planet and the mountains of Nepal, and we were confident enough to do it from on the rooftop of a bus. Very exciting. But here, a few years ago, I also went on Google Maps, and there you can see the Ketty Valley in the bottom right of this map. Hebron School is up in Uti, up in the north, further up, and that's a way of exploring and seeking more about this experience I had when I was a boy. So seeking can be done from all sorts of angles and vantage points. So seeking and finding. So finally we got back to Hebron. Secondly, asking. Let me tell you about some experiences of asking. Knowledge is not simply exploration, not just seeking, but it's relying on asking other people. And so it's not as though knowledge is gained entirely by my own efforts. So when you begin to explore something, it's actually pretty important to ask the people who've gone before. Ask your lecturers, ask your parents. When I was doing my MTH at SAIACS, I was casting about for a PhD. They had invited me to stay as a faculty. And so I had the opportunity of doing a PhD, and I was looking for a subject. And as happened, Dr. Paul Hibbert, a renowned anthropologist, and professor of mission. He was visiting, and I happened to ask him. I said, look, I'm looking at the area of epistemology and theology. Where would be a good place to dig? And he said, well, have you thought about a Trinitarian approach to knowing? And that was a really great nudge. He really gave me an encouragement in a way that was a gift to response to my asking. Similarly, Tom Wright, I met on another occasion. And in reading one of his books, he talks about the need for an epistemology of love. And so this is a common experience. When we ask people who know, they give us gifts that are pretty impressive. Well, it's not just academics that involves asking, but when knowledge is interpersonal, then knowledge is even more obviously something that is given to us by grace, something that's a gift from the subject, from the other person. And the known allows itself to be known. And so let me tell you a story. When I was at university in New Zealand, I was fascinated with a girl in my hometown. And of course, we knew each other, but she was over there and I was very shy. So it took me years to pluck up the courage to strike up a real conversation. And it took me even longer to actually ask her on a date. And then it was months of getting over the pain because her answer was, no, I don't want to go out with you. I don't want to know you. So still wishing her well, I set out to forget her. So how surprising, a year later, she opened the door. And here we are on the day we were engaged, and we have now been married for 43 years. So what I'm saying is that knowledge is interpersonal, and knowledge is often the result of a gift, a privilege to receive from somebody, not simply something that I have discovered or I have made possible. Yes, I was seeking, of course, but much more importantly, I was asking. And so seeking and asking go hand in hand. And so when we discover things, even in academics, when you discover things in your classes, you are being given a gift. And as you trust your teachers, so you will find your knowledge expanding. The third area we're talking about is involvement or context and having the door opened. So asking and seeking and finding, they all occur along the journey of our involvement with what we are seeking to know. And I just want to highlight that all knowledge happens in a particular context. And that context involves our history, our personal history, our nation's history, our culture, our geography, actually even eschatology. This is all part of the context in which we are knocking on doors. And so as the door opens, we are involved in relational dynamics with the people who open the door, with the knowledge that we learn. And in other words, there can be aha moments in our understanding, moments when suddenly it all falls into place and we say, yes, now I've got it. Now I understand. So there were some fascinating examples of this in my life, and I can share one with you. I was tremendously excited to discover in Karl Barth patterns of knowing, patterns that I had encountered in less theological contexts. So let me explain. I did an MTH at SAIACS and a PhD later on the same subject, but from different directions. The first was from below, and the second was from above. So the epistemology that starts from below it looks at the phenomenology of our experience. How do we know? What happens when we know? And it tries to bring that into coherent relationship with the revelation that God has given us in the Bible. And I discovered three important themes. And I began to wonder if those three themes were somehow Trinitarian. But I was thinking, surely that's imagining things. It might be just that I'm imagining Trinitarian because there are three things, and threeness is not proof of Trinitarianness in the slightest. So was I simply reading into what I was seeing, this idea? So in the later study in my PhD, I tackled it the other direction. I began from the Bible and from theology. In particular, I studied the theology of Karl Barth and went towards our experience of knowing. And that's the reverse direction, what's called from above to below. And imagine how my heart glowed when I started to see those same three ideas at work in all sorts of places in Barth's theology. In a sense, that was an aha moment. A door opened for me. That was a way in which suddenly I felt I'd received a gift. And all I can say is that these three themes of asking and seeking and knocking, or in other words, committedness, openness, and relationality. These three ideas have been tremendously exciting for me, and I hope that you will find them exciting too. So after I finished a PhD at SAIACS, then I went home to New Zealand, and my church asked me, the denomination asked me to be the principal of a college, their college called Pathways College in New Zealand. And, you know, that was a privilege, but there was a problem. It had just been amalgamated. Two schools had been dwindling in numbers, and they were having troubles. And then they amalgamated, and I was made the principal a couple of years after the amalgamation. And it was on the verge of closing down. It was residential based, and the churches of my country did not trust this institution anymore. Fewer and fewer students were signing up for residential classroom-centered courses. And so after listening to some rather blunt criticism and opinions, I could see that some radical change was going to be necessary if we were going to survive. So I began to ask the question, is learning best offered as knowledge conveyed to receptive minds in classrooms? Maybe that's not the best way for everybody. Yes, I enjoyed learning that way, but a lot of people didn't. And so recognizing the power of contextual learning, of the importance of involvement, a particular place. Everyone is in a particular place in their life, a particular place in their ministry. And so letting the learning connect with that context was an idea. So we restructured the whole college around internship. Now, I know HBI does a lot of learning in practice and in mission trips and these things. So I'm sure the power of context is being harnessed in HBI as well. But my experience in New Zealand was that this dramatically changed the nature of the college. It changed the success of the college. Suddenly, students were wanting to join, churches were wanting to partner, and the numbers have lifted greatly since that time. So knowledge is increasingly impacting or transformative when we involve people in seeking and in asking and in knocking on the doors that they are living next to. So when there is a church they're involved with, help the learning connect to that door. When there's a ministry they're involved with, then help the learning connect to the door that's involved in their activity. So Jesus understood all this way back at the beginning, the Sermon on the Mount. Knowing and receiving good gifts comes from asking, seeking, and knowing, knocking, asking, seeking, and knocking. So after 5 years at Pathways College, I ended up being called to SAIACS and took up the role of principalship there. And the experience of contextual learning was powerful in reshaping what we did with the MA at SAIACS. And we built in context-based learning into the MA. And that was just as transformative as it was in New Zealand. So I remember, for instance, we had an African student who was, in her context-based ministry, was connected with a nearby ministry to street people, rather like Mother Teresa at Calcutta. And she shared how she was getting nowhere in talking with these people. They basically put up a wall, they ignored her, and she wasn't winning. Then, after several weeks, she realized she had been looking down on them. And of course, they were feeling that sense of superiority. And when she humbled herself and approached them as an equal, suddenly the barriers broke down. And I was thinking, man alive, if she had only learned stuff in the classroom, she would never have understood the importance of humility for ministry. We've got to learn to ask and seek and knock and allow people to open doors for us. So I hope I've explained my three themes here: asking, seeking, and knowing.